The morning mist clung to the mountains like a stubborn secret, refusing to lift even as the sun climbed higher over the remote training facility nestled in the Colorado Rockies. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez adjusted her combat boots on the rocky outcrop, watching the other candidates prepare their equipment below. At 26, she was the only woman among the 37 elite soldiers who had made it this far into the advanced sniper school selection process. The whispers followed her everywhere. They thought she couldn't hear them, but sound carried differently in the thin mountain air. "What's she even doing here?" muttered Corporal Jackson, a hulking man from Tennessee whose arms looked like tree trunks. "This ain't no place for playing dress-up." Sergeant First Class Morrison, a veteran with more confirmed kills than most of the candidates had years of service, shook his head as he cleaned his rifle barrel. "Command's gone soft, letting political correctness mess with real warfare. Next thing you know, they'll be sending kindergarten teachers to the front lines." Elena had heard variations of these comments for the past 8 years of her military career. She'd learned to let them roll off her back like water off a duck's feathers, but that didn't mean they didn't sting. What these men didn't know, what nobody knew, was that she'd been preparing for this moment since she was 12 years old. Growing up on her grandfather's ranch in New Mexico, her grandfather, Miguel Vasquez, had been a legend in his own right. A Marine Corps scout sniper in Vietnam, he'd returned home with stories that most men would never tell, and skills that most would never need. But Miguel had seen something special in his granddaughter from the moment she could hold a rifle steady. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, Elena was learning about wind drift calculations and bullet drop compensation. "Mija," Miguel would say in his gravelly voice, worn rough by decades of cigarettes and desert wind. "Shooting is not about the gun. It's about the mind. The gun is just the tool. Your mind is the weapon." Those lessons came flooding back now as Elena watched the instructors set up the day's challenge. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact man with eyes like chips of obsidian, called the group to attention. His reputation preceded him. He was known for breaking candidates who thought they were tougher than they actually were. "Listen up, candidates," Rodriguez barked, his voice carrying across the training ground with military precision. "Today we separate the shooters from the snipers. Anyone can hit a target at 300 meters with a good scope and favorable conditions. But a real sniper can adapt to any situation, any environment, any challenge." He gestured toward a series of targets set up at varying distances across the valley. The closest was at 400 meters, the furthest at 1,200. Between them, obstacles had been carefully placed. Trees, rocks, and artificial barriers that would test not just accuracy, but tactical thinking. "You'll have 6 shots total," Rodriguez continued. "1 at each target, moving from closest to furthest. Points are awarded not just for accuracy, but for time, technique, and adaptability. The bottom 10 scores are out of the program. No second chances, no do-overs." Elena felt her heart rate slow down, the way it always did when she was about to shoot. It was a trick her grandfather had taught her. Instead of fighting the adrenaline, she learned to channel it, to use it as fuel for focus, rather than letting it become a distraction. The candidates were called up in reverse alphabetical order, which meant Elena would be among the last to shoot. She used the time to study the other shooters, watching their techniques, their breathing patterns, the way they handled their rifles. Most of them were good. You didn't make it this far without serious skills. But she noticed something interesting. Almost all of them were rushing. Corporal Jackson went up first, his massive frame dwarfing his rifle despite its considerable size. He hit 5 of the 6 targets cleanly, missing only the final shot at 1,200 meters when a gust of wind caught his bullet just as it reached the target. Still a respectable showing that earned nods of approval from the instructors. One by one, the candidates took their turns. Some performed better than expected, others worse. Sergeant Morrison, despite his trash talk earlier, proved why he had his reputation, hitting all 6 targets with mechanical precision. His time wasn't the fastest, but his accuracy was flawless. When Elena's name was finally called, the conversations around her died to a whisper. She could feel dozens of eyes following her as she approached the firing line, but she kept her focus forward. Rodriguez handed her a rifle she'd never used before, A test within the test. Different rifles had different characteristics, and part of being a sniper was adapting instantly to whatever equipment was available. She took a moment to familiarize herself with the weapon, checking the scope adjustment, feeling the trigger pull, getting a sense for the rifle's balance. It was a good weapon, well maintained and properly zeroed. In her peripheral vision, she could see some of the other candidates sharing knowing looks, probably betting on how badly she was about to embarrass herself. The first target at 400 meters was almost insultingly easy. Elena settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing, and sent her first round downrange. The spotter called out "dead center" immediately. A few eyebrows raised, but 400 meters was still within the realm of what many considered lucky shooting. The second target at 600 meters required her to adjust for a slight crosswind that had picked up since the earlier shooters. Elena took an extra moment to read the wind, watching the way the grass moved in the valley below, feeling the air currents against her cheek. Her second shot struck just left of center, still well within the scoring zone, but not perfect. By the third target at 800 meters, the wind had become more erratic. This was where many of the earlier candidates had started to struggle. Elena forced herself to slow down even more, ignoring the pressure to rush. She watched the wind indicators for a full minute before taking her shot, waiting for the pattern she'd observed to repeat itself. When she squeezed the trigger, the bullet found its mark dead center. A murmur rippled through the watching candidates. 3 for 3 was nothing to sneeze at, and the difficulty was only going to increase. The fourth target sat at 1,000 meters, positioned behind a natural screen of pine trees that created its own microclimate of swirling air currents. Elena had watched 3 previous shooters miss this target entirely, their bullets caught by unpredictable wind shifts caused by the trees. She took her time studying the problem. The trees created a Venturi effect, accelerating wind through the gaps between them. But the pattern wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, a cycle that repeated every 20 to 30 seconds. Elena waited, watching, counting, until she was sure she understood the timing. When she fired, the bullet seemed to hang in the air for an eternity before the spotter's voice cut through the silence. Direct hit. Now she had everyone's attention. 4 for 4 at 1,000 meters wasn't luck anymore. Even Rodriguez was watching her with new interest, his expression unreadable behind his dark sunglasses. The fifth target at 1,100 meters was positioned on a steep hillside, requiring her to account for the upward angle as well as wind and distance. Elena made her calculations quickly but carefully, adjusting her point of aim to compensate for the reduced effect of gravity on the angled shot. Her bullet struck slightly high but still within the scoring zone. 5 for 5. The training ground had gone completely quiet, except for the whisper of wind through the pines. The final target sat at 1,200 meters, the maximum distance for the exercise. At this range, even with perfect conditions, hitting a man-sized target required not just skill but a deep understanding of ballistics, atmospheric conditions, and the specific characteristics of the rifle and ammunition being used. Elena settled into her final shooting position and began her analysis. The wind was complex at this distance, with different air currents at various altitudes between her position and the target. The temperature had risen slightly since the morning, affecting air density. The target itself was positioned at a slightly lower elevation, requiring her to account for the downward angle. She made her adjustments deliberately, taking more time than she had for any of the previous shots. She could feel the impatience radiating from some of the watchers, but she ignored it completely. This was exactly the kind of pressure her grandfather had prepared her for during those long afternoons on the ranch. "Remember, Mija," she could almost hear his voice saying. "The moment you start rushing is the moment you start missing. Take the time you need. Make every shot count." Elena controlled her breathing, settled deeper into her position, and found that zone of perfect calm that every precision shooter learned to access. The world narrowed down to just her, the rifle, and the distant target. She squeezed the trigger with the same gentle pressure she'd been practicing since she was 12 years old. The bullet's flight time at 1,200 meters was long enough that she could actually track its path through her scope, watching as it arced through the mountain air. When it finally reached the target, the spotter's call came back loud and clear. Bullseye. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't just surprise anymore. This was the silence of men who were forced to completely recalibrate their assumptions. Elena had just shot a perfect score, 6 for 6, at distances where even experienced snipers expected to miss at least once. As she cleared her rifle and stood up from the firing line, Elena caught sight of Rodriguez approaching her. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "Not bad, Vasquez," he said quietly, loud enough for only her to hear. "But don't let it go to your head. This was just the warm-up." Elena nodded respectfully. "Yes, Master Sergeant." "Tell me something," Rodriguez continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Where exactly did you learn to shoot like that? Your personnel file says you grew up in New Mexico, but it doesn't mention any formal marksmanship training before you enlisted." "My grandfather taught me, Master Sergeant. He was a Marine Scout sniper in Vietnam." Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly. "What was his name?" "To one. Miguel Vasquez, Master Sergeant. Served with the 3rd Marine Division." Something shifted in Rodriguez's expression. A flash of recognition. Maybe even respect. "Miguel Vasquez. I've heard that name before. If you're half the shooter he was, then maybe you do belong here after all." As Elena walked back toward the equipment area, she could feel the other candidates watching her differently now. The casual dismissal was gone, replaced by something more complex. A mixture of respect, curiosity, and in some cases, resentment. She'd proven that she could shoot, but she knew that was just the beginning. Corporal Jackson approached her as she was cleaning her borrowed rifle, his expression more serious than she'd seen before. "That was some impressive shooting back there," he said grudgingly. "I mean, seriously impressive." "Thank you," Elena replied simply, not sure where the conversation was headed. "But I gotta ask," Jackson continued, lowering his voice. "Shooting paper targets on a range is one thing. You ever actually had to put crosshairs on a human being and pull the trigger? Because that's a whole different kind of test, and it's coming whether we like it or not." Elena met his gaze steadily. "I guess we'll find out when the time comes, won't we?" Jackson studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "I guess we will." As the afternoon wore on, Elena found herself grouped with the top performers for additional exercises. The instructors were pushing them harder now, testing not just their shooting skills but their ability to work under pressure, to think tactically, and to operate as part of a team. During a camouflage and concealment exercise, Elena demonstrated skills that once again caught her instructors off guard. While other candidates struggled to remain hidden in the rocky terrain, she seemed to simply disappear into the landscape. When Rodriguez finally spotted her, she was less than 50 meters away from his position, completely invisible until she moved. "Where the hell did you learn fieldcraft like that?" he demanded. "Same place I learned to shoot, Master Sergeant. My grandfather didn't just teach me marksmanship, he taught me everything he knew about being a sniper." That evening, as the candidates settled into their barracks for the night, Elena overheard a conversation between two of the instructors outside the building. They were talking about her, and their words made her blood run cold. "I don't care how well she shot today," one of them was saying. "This whole program is about to get a reality check. We just received new orders from command. The top graduates aren't going to some cushy training assignment. They're going straight to Afghanistan, to some of the hottest zones in the country." "You think she can handle that?" the second instructor asked. "I think we're about to find out. Because if she can't, it won't just be her life on the line. It'll be the lives of every soldier who has to depend on her to watch their backs." Elena stared up at the ceiling of the barracks, listening to the quiet sounds of 36 other candidates settling in for sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, and new opportunities to prove herself. But tonight, in the darkness, she allowed herself a moment to think about what lay ahead. She thought about her grandfather, gone now for 3 years, and wondered what he would say if he could see her now. She thought about the doubts and whispers that had followed her throughout her career, and she thought about the responsibility that came with the skills he had taught her. The responsibility to use them not for personal glory, but in service of something greater than herself. Whatever tests lay ahead, Elena knew she was ready. She had been preparing for this her entire life, even if she hadn't known it at the time. Tomorrow, she would continue to prove that assumptions could be dangerous things, and that sometimes the most unlikely person could turn out to be exactly what the situation required. The wind outside the barracks continued to whisper through the pines, carrying with it the promise of challenges yet to come. 3 weeks into the advanced sniper school program, Elena had established herself as more than just a good shooter. While other candidates struggled with the increasingly complex challenges, she seemed to adapt to each new test with an ease that both impressed and frustrated her instructors. The morning started with what Rodriguez called stress shooting, a combination of physical exhaustion and mental pressure designed to simulate combat conditions. After a grueling 5-mile run through the mountain terrain carrying full combat loads, the candidates were expected to engage targets at various distances, while their heart rates were still elevated and their hands were shaking from fatigue. Most of the remaining 22 candidates struggled with this exercise. Precision shooting required steady hands and controlled breathing, both of which were nearly impossible to achieve immediately after intense physical exertion. Elena watched Corporal Jackson miss 3 of his 5 shots, his massive frame heaving with exhaustion as he tried to steady his rifle. When her turn came, Elena approached the firing line with the same methodical calm she demonstrated throughout the program. The secret, her grandfather had taught her, wasn't to fight the physical stress, but to incorporate it into her shooting routine. Instead of waiting for her heart rate to slow down, she learned to time her shots with her heartbeat, firing during the natural pause between beats. Her first shot at 300 meters found its mark despite her elevated pulse. The second, at 500 meters, struck just outside the center ring but well within the scoring zone. By her third shot at 700 meters, she had found her rhythm, and the bullet hit dead center. "Impossible," muttered Sergeant Morrison, who had been watching from the sideline after completing his own mediocre performance. "Nobody shoots that well when they're that winded." But Elena's performance was just getting started. Over the following days, the exercises became increasingly challenging and increasingly realistic. They practiced shooting from urban environments, with targets partially concealed behind simulated building structures. They learned to estimate range without laser rangefinders, to calculate wind drift in complex terrain, and to make split-second decisions about target priority. During one particularly challenging exercise, the candidates were given a scenario where they had to protect a convoy from elevated positions, while enemy targets appeared randomly at various distances. Most of the shooters focused on the closest, most obvious threats, but Elena demonstrated a tactical awareness that caught everyone's attention. Instead of engaging the nearest targets first, she systematically eliminated the threats that posed the greatest danger to the convoy. Even when they were farther away and more difficult to hit, her shooting was precise and efficient. But more importantly, it was smart. She understood not just how to hit targets, but which targets needed to be hit first. Instructor Williams, a former Army Ranger with extensive combat experience, pulled Elena aside after the exercise. "Vasquez, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. Have you studied tactical shooting doctrine before coming here?" "No, sir," Elena replied honestly. "But my grandfather used to tell me stories about his missions in Vietnam. He would walk me through the decisions he made, help me understand why he chose one target over another." Williams nodded slowly. "Your grandfather sounds like he was one hell of a teacher. The tactical awareness you demonstrated today is something we usually have to drill into people over months of training. You seem to understand it instinctively." As the weeks progressed, Elena's reputation among the remaining candidates evolved from skepticism to grudging respect to something approaching awe. She consistently scored at the top of every exercise, but more than that, she helped elevate the performance of those around her. When Corporal Jackson was struggling with long-range wind calculations, Elena quietly showed him a technique her grandfather had taught her for reading environmental conditions. When Private Rodriguez was having trouble with camouflage techniques, she shared fieldcraft knowledge that seemed to come from decades of experience rather than a few weeks of training. The atmosphere in the program began to change as well. What had started as a competition between individuals slowly transformed into something more collaborative. Elena's example seemed to inspire the other candidates to focus less on beating each other and more on pushing themselves to achieve their maximum potential. But the real test came during the 6th week of the program, when the candidates were informed about their final challenge. Master Sergeant Rodriguez gathered the remaining 15 candidates in the briefing room, his expression more serious than they'd seen throughout the entire program. Behind him, a large map of mountainous terrain covered the wall, marked with various symbols and elevation markers. "Gentlemen and lady," he began, nodding toward Elena. "What I'm about to tell you is classified. Your final exercise will not be a simulation. For the past 6 months, intelligence has been tracking a high-value target in this region." He gestured toward the map. "A terrorist leader responsible for multiple attacks on U.S. and coalition forces. He's been moving through this mountain area, always staying just ahead of our conventional forces." The room was completely silent. This was what they had all been training for, but the reality of it still hit like a physical blow. Rodriguez continued. "The mission is simple in concept, complex in execution. You'll be inserted in teams of 2 at various points around this valley. Your objective is to locate and maintain surveillance on the target until a strike team can move in for capture. The challenges are significant: extreme range, difficult terrain, and the target has proven to be extremely cautious and well protected." He turned to face the candidates directly. "The maximum engagement range for this operation could exceed anything you've trained for. We're talking about shots at distances where the curvature of the Earth becomes a factor in your calculations. This is not a training exercise. Lives depend on your performance." 2,000 feet. Elena felt a chill run down her spine, but not from fear. This was the moment her grandfather had been preparing her for without either of them knowing it. All those hours on the ranch, all those stories about Vietnam, all those lessons about patience and precision, they had been leading to this. The candidates were divided into pairs based on their performance throughout the program and their complementary skills. Elena was partnered with Sergeant First Class Morrison, the veteran sniper who had initially dismissed her presence in the program. Their relationship had evolved considerably over the past weeks, moving from open hostility to grudging respect to something approaching partnership. "I'll be honest with you, Vasquez," Morrison said as they prepared their equipment for the mission. "When this program started, I figured you'd wash out in the first week. I thought you were just here to make some political statement about women in combat roles." Elena continued packing her gear, not responding immediately. Morrison continued. "But I was wrong. Dead wrong. You're not just a good shooter. You're one of the best I've ever seen. And more than that, you think like a sniper. It's not something that can be taught. Either you have it, or you don't." "Thank you," Elena said simply. "Don't thank me yet," Morrison replied grimly. "Because where we're going, being good might not be good enough. We're going to be operating at the absolute limits of what's humanly possible. The shots we might have to take, hell, most people would say they're impossible." Elena looked up from her pack, meeting Morrison's eyes directly. "My grandfather used to say that impossible shots are just the ones that haven't been made yet." Morrison studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Well, I guess we're about to find out if your grandfather was right." The helicopter insertion happened under cover of darkness, with each sniper team being dropped at different points around the target area. Elena and Morrison were given the northernmost position, which offered the longest potential engagement ranges, but also the most challenging terrain. As they moved through the darkness toward their assigned overwatch position, Elena felt a sense of calm settle over her that was almost surreal. This was what she had been born to do, what she had been trained for her entire life. Every step through the rocky terrain felt familiar. Every shadow and sound registered with perfect clarity. They reached their position 2 hours before dawn, giving them time to set up their hide and prepare for what could be days of patient observation. The position offered a commanding view of the entire valley, with clear sightlines to distances that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. "Jesus," Morrison whispered as he surveyed the terrain through his spotting scope. Some of these shots would be over 2,000 meters, maybe more. Elena was already studying the same terrain through her rifle scope, making mental notes about wind patterns, elevation changes, and potential shooting lanes. At these distances, a shot would take several seconds to reach its target. The bullet would arc through multiple air currents, possibly encountering different weather conditions at different altitudes. "It's possible," she said quietly. "Difficult, but possible." Morrison looked at her with something between admiration and disbelief. "You're actually serious, aren't you? You think you could make a shot at that distance?" Elena adjusted her scope, continuing to study the valley below. "I won't know until I try, but my grandfather always told me that the only impossible shot is the one you don't take." As the sun began to rise over the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley floor, Elena settled into the patient mindset that would define the next phase of their mission. Somewhere in that vast expanse of rocky terrain, their target was moving. It was her job to find him, and if necessary, to make a shot that would test every skill she had ever learned. The morning mist began to lift from the valley, revealing details that had been hidden in the darkness. Elena started her systematic scanning, dividing the terrain into sectors and examining each one methodically. This was the unglamorous part of sniper work. Hours or even days of careful observation, waiting for the perfect moment that might never come. But as she watched and waited, Elena felt the presence of her grandfather beside her, as if he were guiding her hands and eyes just as he had all those years ago on the ranch. She was ready for whatever came next, ready to prove that sometimes the most unlikely person could be exactly what a desperate situation required. The hunt had begun. 48 hours into the surveillance mission, Elena and Morrison had settled into a routine of patient observation that tested every aspect of their training and endurance. Their hide, carefully constructed among the rocky outcroppings of the northern ridge, provided an unobstructed view of the valley below, while keeping them invisible to anyone looking up from the lower elevations. The target area was vast. Nearly 12 square kilometers of rugged mountain terrain, crisscrossed with ancient goat paths, seasonal riverbeds, and natural caves that could hide an army. Intelligence had narrowed down the terrorist leader's probable location to somewhere within this valley. But finding one man in such an expanse was like searching for a specific grain of sand on a beach. Elena took the first watch each morning, using the golden hour just after sunrise when shadows were long and movement was easier to detect. Morrison spelled her during the heat of the day, when thermal shimmer made long-range observation nearly impossible. They communicated in whispers when they spoke at all, maintaining the discipline that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. On the morning of the third day, Elena noticed something that made her pause in her systematic scanning of the valley floor. Far below, at what she estimated to be nearly 2,500 meters, a small group of figures was moving along one of the goat paths. At that distance, even with her high-powered scope, they appeared as little more than dark specks against the light-colored rock. "Movement," she whispered to Morrison, who immediately rolled into position beside her with his spotting scope. "I see them," Morrison confirmed after a moment. 4 5 individuals moving southeast along the ridge trail. Can't make out details at this range." Elena adjusted her scope's magnification to maximum and studied the distant figures more carefully. Their movement pattern was tactical. They maintained appropriate spacing, used available cover, and moved with the disciplined pace of experienced fighters rather than local villagers. "These aren't goat herders," she murmured. Morrison nodded grimly. "Agreed. Question is, are they our guys or just random militants?" Elena continued tracking the group through her scope, noting details that might become important later. The lead figure was slightly taller than the others, carried himself with an air of authority, and the group seemed to defer to his direction when they paused to assess their route. "Second from the front," Elena said quietly. Something about his posture, the way the others looked to him for guidance. "You think it could be him? Maybe. But at this distance, even if I was certain, there's no way to make the shot. Too far, too many variables." Morrison checked his rangefinder and whistled softly. 2,400 meters, and that's line of sight. Actual distance with the elevation difference is probably closer to 2,600. At such extreme range, Elena knew that even her best shot would be more like throwing dice than precision marksmanship. The bullet would spend over 3 seconds in flight, traveling through multiple atmospheric layers with different wind patterns, temperatures, and air densities. The target could easily move several feet in the time it took the bullet to arrive. But as she continued to observe, Elena noticed something that made her reconsider. The group was moving toward a natural choke point in the terrain, a narrow passage between two rocky spires, where they would have to traverse an open area with limited cover. If she could predict their timing and account for all the variables, there might be a window of opportunity. "Morrison," she said quietly. "Look at their route. See where they're heading?" Morrison traced the path through his spotting scope and immediately understood. The gap between those two rock formations. They'll have to cross about 50 meters of open ground, and based on their current pace, they'll reach that point in approximately 12 minutes. Morrison looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Vasquez. That would be the longest confirmed sniper kill in military history. The current record is just over 2,400 meters. What you're talking about is pushing the absolute limits of physics." Elena was already running calculations in her head, considering every factor that would affect the bullet's flight path: wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes, air temperature, humidity, the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation, even the slight difference in gravitational pull. At their elevated position, it's theoretically possible, she said. The conditions are about as good as we're likely to get. Clear air, relatively stable wind patterns, and if that's our target, we may not get another opportunity like this. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying both the terrain and Elena's face. Finally, he keyed his radio to contact the mission commander. "Overwatch North to command," he said quietly. "We have possible visual on primary target at approximately 2,600 meters. Requesting permission to attempt engagement." The response came back immediately. "Overwatch North. Confirm your range estimate." "Roger, command. Range is 2,600 meters. Repeat 2,600 meters. A longer pause this time. Then, "Overwatch North. That's quite a distance. Are you confident in your shooter's ability at that range?" Morrison looked at Elena, who was already making final adjustments to her rifle and calculating holdover values. She nodded once, meeting his eyes with steady confidence. "Command, Overwatch North. Yes, I am confident in my shooter's ability." "Roger, Overwatch North. You are cleared to engage at your discretion. Good hunting." Elena felt the familiar calm descend over her as she prepared for the most challenging shot of her life. Every lesson her grandfather had taught her seemed to crystallize in this moment. Patience, precision, and the absolute certainty that came from perfect preparation. She began her pre-shot routine methodically. First, she verified her range estimate using both her scope's built-in rangefinder and Morrison's laser device. 2,612 meters, nearly a mile and 2/3. Next, she assessed environmental conditions. The wind at their elevation was steady at roughly 8 miles per hour from the west, but she could see evidence of different wind patterns at various altitudes between their position and the target area. The temperature was climbing as the morning progressed, which would affect air density and therefore bullet trajectory. Using her ballistic calculator, Elena determined that her bullet would drop approximately 32 feet over the course of its flight, requiring her to aim well above her intended point of impact. The wind would push the bullet roughly 18 inches to the east. Though that calculation was complicated by the changing wind patterns at different altitudes. Most challenging of all was accounting for the time of flight. At this distance, her bullet would take over 3 seconds to reach the target. If her intended target maintained his current pace, she would need to aim at a point several feet ahead of where he was when she fired. "Target is approaching the open area," Morrison reported quietly. Approximately 2 minutes to crossing point. Elena settled deeper into her shooting position, checking her natural point of aim one final time. Her rifle was perfectly stable, supported by a bipod in front and a sandbag under the stock. Her breathing had slowed to the deep, controlled rhythm she'd learned as a child. 1 minute to target zone, Morrison called softly. Elena could see the distant figures through her scope now, still barely more than moving dots, but definitely human. The lead figure matched the height and build described in their intelligence briefing, and his movement pattern suggested the caution of someone who knew he was being hunted. Target entering the kill zone. Now. Elena tracked the lead figure through her scope, watching as he emerged from cover and began crossing the open area. She led him slightly, accounting for his movement, then settled her crosshairs on a point in empty space, where her calculations told her he would be when her bullet arrived. The distance was so great that she had to account for the curvature of the Earth itself. At over 2,600 meters, the target was actually below the horizon line, visible only because of their elevated position. This was shooting at the very edge of what was physically possible with conventional rifle and ammunition. Elena controlled her breathing, found the natural pause between heartbeats, and began her trigger squeeze. Smooth, steady pressure. Just as her grandfather had taught her 30 years before, on a ranch that seemed like another lifetime, the rifle recoiled against her shoulder, and Elena watched through her scope as the bullet began its long journey across the valley. At this distance, she could actually see the bullet's vapor trail as it arced through the morning air, following the precise trajectory her calculations had predicted. 3.5 seconds felt like an eternity. Elena held her breath, watching as the tiny figure continued moving across the open ground, unaware that death was racing toward him through the thin mountain air. When the bullet finally reached its destination, the effect was unmistakable even at that extreme range. The target dropped instantly, and Elena could see the other figures scatter for cover, their disciplined formation dissolving into chaos. "Target down," Morrison called into his radio, his voice filled with awe. "I repeat, target is down." Shot fired from 2,612 meters. Confirmed hit. The response from command was immediate. "Overwatch North, confirm your range and confirm target status." Command, target is down and appears deceased. Range was 2,612 meters. I say again, 2,612 meters. A long pause, then, Overwatch North. That would be a record. Stand by for strike team confirmation. Elena safeguarded her weapon and rolled away from the scope, finally allowing herself to process what had just happened. She had made a shot that most experts would have declared impossible, at a distance that pushed the absolute limits of rifle marksmanship. Morrison was staring at her with an expression of complete amazement. "Do you realize what you just did? That shot is going to be talked about for the next 50 years. Elena felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. The shot had been perfect. Everything her grandfather had trained her to achieve. But it had also taken a human life from a distance so great that her target never even knew he was in danger. "My grandfather always said that every shot teaches you something," Elena replied quietly. "I guess I just learned what I'm truly capable of." 20 minutes later, the strike team reached the location where the target had fallen. The radio confirmation that followed would change Elena's life forever. "Command, this is strike team leader. Target is confirmed deceased. Positive identification on primary objective. Mission accomplished." Elena had not just made an impossible shot. She had eliminated one of the most wanted terrorists in the region, ending a manhunt that had lasted over 2 years and preventing untold future attacks on coalition forces. As they prepared to extract from their position, Morrison shook his head in continued amazement. "You know they're going to want to study this shot, right? Ballistics experts, military historians, probably half the sniper community. You just rewrote the book on what's possible." Elena packed her equipment with the same methodical care she brought to everything else. "All I did was apply what I was taught. My grandfather would say the shot was just the ending, everything that came before. The patience, the preparation, the understanding of conditions. That's what really mattered." But even as she spoke those words, Elena knew that her life had just changed forever. She was no longer the woman everyone assumed couldn't be a real sniper. She was now the sniper who had made the most impossible shot in military history, proving once and for all that assumptions could be deadly mistakes. News of Elena's extraordinary shot spread through military channels like wildfire. Within hours of the mission's completion, ballistics experts from around the world were requesting details about the engagement. The shot had broken the previous record by over 200 meters, achieved under combat conditions that made the accomplishment even more remarkable. But Elena found herself struggling with the sudden attention and notoriety. She had spent her entire military career fighting to be taken seriously as a soldier, not as a curiosity or a symbol. Now, she was being hailed as a hero and a breakthrough figure for women in combat roles, descriptions that made her profoundly uncomfortable. The first indication of how much her life had changed came during the debriefing session 3 days after the mission. Instead of the usual small room with a couple of intelligence officers, Elena found herself facing a panel that included generals, Pentagon officials, and representatives from various special operations commands. General Patricia Hammond, a stern woman with silver hair and 3 stars on her collar, led the questioning. Sergeant Vasquez, I want to start by saying that your achievement is remarkable by any standard. The shot you made will likely stand as a record for decades to come. Thank you, General, Elena replied, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the formal atmosphere. What I need to understand, Hammond continued, is how you developed the skills that made such a shot possible. Your military training, while excellent, doesn't fully account for the level of expertise you demonstrated. Elena found herself once again explaining her grandfather's influence, the years of training on the New Mexico ranch, and the unconventional education she'd received in marksmanship and fieldcraft. But this time, her audience was taking notes and asking technical questions that suggested her story was being documented for purposes beyond simple curiosity. Colonel Martinez, a special operations veteran with extensive combat experience, leaned forward in his chair. Sergeant, we're putting together a new program. An advanced sniper training course that would incorporate the techniques and principles that made your shot possible. We'd like you to help develop the curriculum. Elena felt a moment of panic. Sir, with respect, I'm not sure I'm qualified to train other snipers. I've only been in the program for a few weeks myself. Sergeant, General Hammond interjected, you just made a shot that our best instructors said was theoretically impossible. I'd say that qualifies you to teach others. The conversation continued for another hour, with Elena gradually understanding that she was being offered an opportunity that most soldiers could only dream of. The military wanted to study her techniques, document her training methods, and use her knowledge to create a new generation of long-range precision shooters. But it also meant giving up the anonymity she had valued throughout her career. She would become a public figure, a symbol of women's capabilities in combat, and a subject of intense scrutiny from both supporters and critics. When the debriefing finally ended, Elena was given 72 hours to consider the offer. She used that time to call her grandmother, the only family she had left since her grandfather's death. Mija, her grandmother said after Elena had explained the situation, your grandfather always believed you were destined for something special, but he also taught you to follow your own path, not the path others wanted to lay out for you. I know, Abuela. But this feels bigger than just my own choices. If I can help train other soldiers, maybe save lives by making them better at their jobs, then you already know what you have to do. Your grandfather didn't teach you to shoot just so you could break records. He taught you so you could serve something greater than yourself. Elena made her decision that night, but it came with conditions. She would help develop the advanced training program, but she wanted to remain an active-duty sniper. She wouldn't become a full-time instructor or a poster child for military equality. She would teach when needed, but she would also continue to serve in operational roles where her skills could make a direct difference. To her surprise, the military brass agreed to her terms. Within 2 weeks, Elena found herself assigned to a new special operations unit that was being formed specifically to handle extreme long-range missions. The unit was small, only 8 snipers total. But each member had been selected for exceptional abilities and the potential to operate in situations where conventional forces couldn't be effective. The unit's first operational mission came 6 months later. Intelligence had identified a terrorist training camp in a remote mountain region where traditional approaches were impossible due to the terrain and political sensitivities. The camp was surrounded by valleys that created perfect natural choke points, but the distances involved were beyond the capabilities of most military snipers. Elena found herself partnered once again with Morrison, who had requested assignment to the new unit specifically to work with her. Their relationship had evolved into genuine mutual respect and effective tactical partnership. "Feels like old times," Morrison said as they established their hide overlooking the target area. "Except this time, we're looking at potential shots that make your record seem routine." Elena was studying the terrain through her scope, mentally calculating distances and angles. The terrorist camp was situated in a valley bowl, nearly 3,000 meters away, protected by natural barriers that made conventional assault nearly impossible. 3,200 meters to the main compound, Elena murmured. "But look at the wind patterns down there. Those ridgelines are creating thermal updrafts that are going to be unpredictable." Morrison nodded grimly. "Command is calling this an assessment mission. But we both know what they really want. They want to know if your shot 6 months ago was luck or skill." Elena understood the subtext. Her record shot had made her famous within military circles, but there were still doubters who attributed her success to favorable conditions and good fortune. This mission would either confirm her capabilities or reveal them to be a one-time anomaly. Over the next 2 days, Elena and Morrison conducted detailed surveillance of the camp, documenting movement patterns, identifying high-value targets, and assessing the feasibility of long-range engagement. The challenges were even greater than their previous mission. The distances were longer, the wind patterns more complex, and the targets were more alert to the possibility of sniper attack. On the third morning, their patience was rewarded. Intelligence intercepts indicated that a major terrorist leader would be visiting the camp that day. Someone even more significant than the target Elena had eliminated 6 months earlier. "Command is giving us authorization for the shot," Morrison reported after receiving radio instructions. "But they're leaving the decision up to us. If you don't think you can make it, we abort and wait for another opportunity." Elena was already running calculations, using every tool and technique her grandfather had taught her, plus everything she'd learned from months of studying her previous shot with ballistics experts. The distance was extraordinary. 3,200 meters over terrain that would create complex wind patterns and thermal effects. "I can make the shot," Elena said quietly, "but I need perfect conditions and perfect timing." They waited for 4 hours, monitoring wind patterns and studying the thermal currents that rose from the valley floor. Elena noticed that there was a brief period each morning, just as the sun crested the eastern ridge, when the wind patterns stabilized and the thermal effects minimized. "Tomorrow morning," Elena told Morrison, "right around 0730, when the sun hits the valley floor but before the thermal buildup starts. That's our window." Morrison trusted her judgment completely by now. "Then that's when we'll take the shot." That evening, as they prepared for what could be their most challenging mission yet, Elena found herself thinking about her grandfather again. She could almost hear his voice, calm and patient as always, reminding her that every shot was just another application of the fundamentals he had taught her decades before. "Remember, Mija," she could imagine him saying, "distance doesn't change the basics. Breathing, trigger control, follow through. The bullet doesn't know how far it has to travel. It just follows the laws of physics." The next morning arrived clear and cold, with minimal wind at their elevation. Elena began her pre-shot routine even before their target appeared, checking every system and calculation multiple times. At this distance, there was no margin for error. At exactly 7:25, their target emerged from one of the camp buildings. Through her scope, Elena could barely make out the figure as more than a dark speck moving across the compound. But intelligence confirmation left no doubt about his identity. "Target acquired," Morrison whispered into his radio. Preparing for shot, Elena settled into her final shooting position. Every muscle relaxed except for those needed to maintain perfect weapon control. Her breathing slowed to the deep, meditative rhythm that had become second nature. The world narrowed down to just her, the rifle, and a target so distant it seemed like an impossible goal. But impossible, as her grandfather had always told her, was just another word for a shot that hadn't been made yet. At precisely 7:30 a.m., as the morning sun stabilized the atmospheric conditions in the valley below, Elena Vasquez squeezed the trigger on what would become the longest confirmed sniper kill in military history. The bullet would travel for nearly 4 seconds through the thin mountain air, crossing a distance that pushed beyond the theoretical limits of rifle marksmanship. As she watched the vapor trail of her bullet arc across the impossible distance, Elena knew that she had once again proven that assumptions about what was possible could be deadly mistakes. She was no longer just breaking records, she was redefining the very limits of what a sniper could achieve. The bullet traveled through the pristine morning air for exactly 3.7 seconds before finding its target at a distance of 3,212 meters. Elena watched through her scope as the tiny figure in the distant compound dropped instantly, confirming what would become the longest sniper kill in recorded military history. The silence that followed was profound. Even Morrison, who had witnessed Elena's previous record shot, seemed stunned by what had just occurred. Through their radio, they could hear the controlled chaos of intelligence officers scrambling to coordinate strike teams and confirm the elimination of one of the world's most wanted terrorists. "Command, this is Overwatch 7, Morrison reported, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just happened. "Target down at 3,212 meters. Repeat, 3,212 meters. The pause that followed their report seemed to last forever. Finally, Command responded. "Overwatch 7. Please confirm your range calculation. Cross-device routing. Commuted sighted 1. Commuted sighted 1. Commuted sighted 1. Commuted sighted 1. Confirmed, Command. 3,212 meters. GPS coordinates and ballistic data will be uploaded for verification." Elena safeguarded her rifle and rolled away from her shooting position, allowing herself a moment to process what she had accomplished. She had just shattered her own world record by over 600 meters, achieving something that military experts had declared mathematically impossible. But more than the distance, what struck Elena was the profound responsibility of what she had done. At such an extreme range, her target had been eliminated without warning, without the chance to surrender, without even knowing he was in danger. The precision and finality of it carried a weight that no amount of training could fully prepare someone for. "Do you understand what you've just done?" Morrison asked quietly as they began preparing for extraction. "This shot is going to change everything. Sniper doctrine, training programs, even the way we think about battlefield geometry. You've just proven that we can engage targets at distances nobody thought possible." Elena nodded, understanding that her life had just changed again in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The first record shot had made her famous within military circles. This second shot would likely make her a legend, studied and analyzed for decades to come. The extraction proceeded smoothly, but Elena could already sense the storm of attention that was building around her achievement. By the time they reached the forward operating base, word had spread throughout the special operations community. Officers who had never spoken to her before were suddenly seeking her out, asking for details about her techniques and training methods. General Hammond arrived at the base within 24 hours, accompanied by an even larger entourage than had debriefed Elena after her first record shot. This time, the group included scientists from military research facilities, ballistics experts from weapons manufacturers, and officials from allied militaries around the world. "Sergeant Vasquez," General Hammond began, "what you've accomplished is unprecedented. We have ballistics experts who are telling us that your shot shouldn't have been physically possible with standard military equipment and ammunition." Elena found herself once again explaining the techniques her grandfather had taught her, but now her audience was taking detailed notes and asking questions about variables she had learned to calculate instinctively. They wanted to understand not just how she had made the shot, but how her methods could be systematized and taught to others. Dr. Sarah Chen, a ballistics physicist from the Army Research Laboratory, leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "Sergeant, the calculations required for your shot would typically require computer modeling and extensive environmental sensors. How did you account for atmospheric density variations, Coriolis effects, and wind patterns at multiple altitudes?" Elena paused, trying to find words for knowledge that felt more intuitive than analytical. "My grandfather taught me to read the environment like a language. Wind doesn't just have speed and direction, it has personality. Each valley, each ridgeline, Each thermal layer tells you something different. You have to listen to all of it and understand how it fits together. The scientists exchanged glances that suggested Elena's explanation was both enlightening and frustrating. They wanted formulas and procedures they could replicate, but Elena was describing an almost artistic understanding of ballistics that couldn't be easily systematized. Colonel Martinez spoke up from the back of the room. "Sergeant, we want to offer you a new position. Lead instructor for a classified program that would train elite snipers from around the world. You would have resources to develop training methods that incorporate your techniques, and you'd work with the best marksmen from allied militaries." Elena felt the same reluctance she had experienced after her first record shot. "Sir, with respect, I didn't develop these skills to become a teacher. I developed them to serve as a soldier. But think about the impact you could have," General Hammond interjected. "If we can teach even a fraction of what you know to other snipers, we could revolutionize how special operations forces engage long-range targets. You could potentially save thousands of lives by making our soldiers more effective." The offer was compelling, but Elena knew it would mean giving up operational assignments in favor of a training role. She would become more valuable as a teacher than as a sniper, relegated to passing on her knowledge rather than applying it directly. "I need time to consider this," Elena said finally. That evening, alone in her quarters, Elena placed a call to her grandmother. The conversation was difficult, not because of the language barrier. They spoke in a mixture of English and Spanish that felt like home, but because Elena was struggling to understand her own feelings about the path being laid out for her. "Abuela, they want to make me into something I never intended to become. They want me to be famous, to be a symbol of what's possible, but I just wanted to serve, to use the skills grandfather taught me to make a difference." Her grandmother was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Mija, your grandfather always said that the greatest warriors are those who know when to fight and when to teach others to fight. Maybe this is your time to teach. But what if I'm not ready? What if I can't pass on what grandfather taught me?" His knowledge came from experience, from understanding that took decades to develop. "You have something your grandfather never had," her grandmother replied. "You have the ability to show the world that strength comes in forms they never expected. Your grandfather fought his war with his rifle. Maybe you're supposed to fight yours by proving that anyone can achieve the impossible if they're willing to learn." Elena spent the night thinking about her grandmother's words and about the legacy her grandfather had left her. He had trained her not just to be a sniper, but to be someone who could carry forward the values he believed in: precision, patience, and service to something greater than oneself. The next morning, Elena made her decision. She would accept the training position, but with conditions that would allow her to maintain some operational capabilities. She would develop the new program, but she would also remain available for special missions that required her unique skills. The compromise satisfied everyone involved. Within 6 months, Elena found herself at the head of a revolutionary training program that attracted elite marksmen from around the world. Her methods, while difficult to quantify scientifically, proved remarkably effective at extending the capabilities of already skilled shooters. But perhaps more importantly, Elena discovered that she had a natural talent for teaching that she had never recognized. She could see the potential in students that others missed, could identify the subtle flaws in technique that prevented good shooters from becoming great ones, and could inspire confidence in people who had never believed they could achieve extraordinary things. 2 years after her record-setting shot, Elena stood before a group of new students at the beginning of their first day in her program. Among them were seasoned veterans with years of combat experience, Olympic-level competitive shooters, and rising stars from various military and law enforcement agencies around the world. "Everyone who enters this program brings assumptions with them," Elena began, her voice carrying the quiet authority she had developed as an instructor. "You assume you know what's possible and what isn't. You assume that certain shots can't be made, that certain distances are beyond human capability, that certain conditions make success impossible." She paused, looking at each student individually. "I'm here to help you understand that assumptions can be the most dangerous thing a sniper carries. The moment you decide something is impossible, you've already missed the shot. Elena picked up her rifle, the same weapon she had used to make her record-setting kills, and continued. My grandfather used to tell me that the rifle doesn't know how far the target is. The bullet doesn't care about the odds against success. Physics is physics, and if you understand the variables and account for them properly, extraordinary things become possible. She could see skepticism in some faces, belief in others, and curiosity in all of them. It was the same mixture of reactions she had encountered throughout her career, from those first dismissive comments at sniper school to the awe and respect she commanded today. Over the next 6 months, you're going to learn techniques that push the boundaries of what conventional wisdom says is possible. Some of you will embrace these methods and achieve things you never imagined. Others will decide that their old assumptions were more comfortable than the uncertainty of constant growth. Elena set her rifle aside and faced the group directly. But for those who are willing to challenge their own limitations, who are ready to prove that the most impossible shot is simply the one that hasn't been taken yet, this program will change not just how you shoot, but how you think about what human potential really means. As she looked at the faces before her, men and women from different countries, backgrounds, and experiences, all united by a desire to achieve something extraordinary, Elena felt the presence of her grandfather more strongly than she had in years. He had taught her to shoot, but more than that, he had taught her to believe that excellence was not a destination, but a journey, that every shot fired was an opportunity to discover new possibilities, and that the greatest victory was not in breaking records, but in proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to accept limitations. Elena Vasquez had started her journey as a young woman everyone assumed couldn't be a real sniper. She had become someone who redefined the very meaning of what was possible in precision marksmanship, but perhaps most importantly, she had learned to pass on not just technical skills, but the understanding that assumptions about human potential were often the only thing preventing people from achieving greatness. The woman who had once struggled to be taken seriously had become someone who helped others discover they were capable of far more than they had ever imagined, and in teaching them to make the impossible shot, she taught them something even more valuable: that the only true limitations were the ones they imposed on themselves.